This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. It's January, so I thought we would feature some January birthdays of women using the book that I have called Remember the Ladies, written by Kirsten Olson originally, actually 30 years ago. So I don't have any really up-to-date new women in my book, but we'll be talking about women from a number of different generations and even centuries, but mostly modern women from the 20th century when I was born, but none from the 21st century, I guess, although some of those women are still around for sure. First, I think we have a picture of 3 women in a bathtub. Yep, there it is. That's so-called. It's an unfinished statue. It just shows the women from the waist up. But these are 19th century women who were famous early feminists. The women are Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and the one on the right in the old-fashioned cap is Lucretia Mott. Lucretia Mott has a January birthday. In fact, the 3rd of January was her birthday, and that was in 1793. So she's actually spanned two centuries. She was one of the people who helped organize the first National Women's Rights meeting at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. Lucretia Mott with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the picture in that shows Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the left. She's quite a matronly, elderly lady there, but she was a younger woman when she and Lucretia Mott set up the Seneca Falls meeting in 1848. This statue is in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. I believe, in fact, I remember seeing it in the rotunda of the Capitol, but they finally decided that maybe it was a little too heavy for the floor. They got to be a little worried about that big several ton, I guess, piece of marble there, and so they put it down on the bottom floor instead. But when I saw it at the U.S. Capitol, it was on the rotunda. Lucretia Mott, being our first person for January, she was a Quaker woman, and she was an abolitionist. She was in favor, certainly, of various liberal causes. And I think we could call her a feminist. I'm wearing my feminist t-shirt today. I think you can see that it actually says feminist on it, right? Don't actually wear it very often. But I thought that in honor of all these women for January, not of all of whom would call themselves feminists, of course, because there are many women who don't like that title. I personally am not among those, which is why I'd be willing to wear a feminist t-shirt. Well, let's see who else we've got in those early days. One woman that I'd like to mention is Olympia Brown, and her claim to fame, she was born on January 5th in 1825. But her claim to fame is that she was the first ordained woman minister in the United States. She was ordained by the Universalist Church, and she was a person who had ties with Ohio. She went to Antioch College, which of course is in Ohio. And interestingly enough, you've heard me talk. In fact, I spoke at some length in the last episode about our Southeast Ohio feminist, Mrs. Gage. And it says right here in the book that the thing that made Olympia Brown consider herself a women's rights person was that she heard the abolitionist Frances Gage speak. So there's a connection right there in the early 19th century. And she said, Olympia Brown said it was the first time that she'd heard a woman preach, and the sense of victory lifted me up, so that she herself became an actual ordained minister. Now, the next picture we're going to see will be that of Margaret Sanger, I believe. Yes, there's a picture of Margaret Sanger in her middle years. Actually, Margaret Sanger was around a very long time, until the 1970s, but she was the founder of Planned Parenthood. And Planned Parenthood got its start in 1916, 1917 actually, as far as the official. I have here the quite long program from the centennial observation of Planned Parenthood from last summer. In June, we celebrated 100 years of Planned Parenthood. And one reason I'm mentioning that, and the fact that Margaret Sanger was the originator of Planned Parenthood, she was the first person. She had been a nurse herself, and she believed that it was very important to help women with their reproductive lives. She had seen many women who had had too many babies too soon. One that she remembered in particular had a baby every year for 4 years. And when the fifth one came along, she died. And that was the end of her. So Margaret Sanger, as a nurse, had seen the problems that women had from too frequent births sometimes. And that was what spurred her to start Planned Parenthood in 1917. She lived in New York State and then New England, and the first of those Planned Parenthood clinics was actually in Brooklyn, New York, started by Margaret Sanger. I mention that because one of the parts of what women can do if they feel it absolutely necessary, if they are pregnant and don't want to be, or it makes them ill, or they're already sick, or they have too many babies already, or whatever, is have a safe and legal abortion. Yesterday, the 23rd of January, was the 45th anniversary of the Roe versus Wade decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, which made abortion safe and legal. Hopefully, of course, we hope that it will be rare, but it's at least safe and legal and has been for 45 years in this country, and it is still being attacked. And not only is it being attacked, but Planned Parenthood itself is being attacked, and funding is always, they always get have, in recent years, they've had some federal funding for the protection that they give to women's health in their clinics. Abortion is done in a few of the Planned Parenthood clinics, but certainly not in any of the ones in Southeast Ohio. But it is a safe and legal operation, and is available in Parkersburg, I believe, and definitely in Columbus. They have a Planned Parenthood clinic which does do abortions. For the most part, Planned Parenthood helps with other types of problems that women may have with their reproductive lives. My husband and I have been supporters of Planned Parenthood since, at least since our marriage, because we were able to find information, get information about birth control when we were both graduate students at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And that was very important to us to postpone having our family until later. So over 60 years now, we've been supporters of Planned Parenthood, and very thankful that Margaret Sanger was the person who was able to bring that to be. Well, women's issues are definitely in the news. And remember, there was this Women's March on the 21st, just a day or two ago, a couple of days ago, starting in front of the Methodist Church here in Athens. And they say that perhaps as many as 500 people gathered, mostly women, but of course there were men supporters also for the women. And both the newspaper, both the Athens News and the Athens Messenger, had very nice pictures on their front pages of the Women's March held in January 21st. And actually that January 21st march that was held here was in part a celebration of a large march that was held a year ago, January 21st, the day after President Trump took the oath of office and became president. There was a very large women's march. Hundreds of thousands of women marched in Washington, D.C. on January 21st, 2017. And yesterday, a couple of days ago, there were once again some thousands and thousands of women turning out all over the country. And here in Athens, we didn't actually have a march in 2017. I remember going to Chillicothe for the march there. But the march that we had here just a couple of days ago drew about 500 participants. So, we women, feminists or not, are definitely out there for women's rights and women's concerns. And I want to talk now about some of the other women who have January birthdays. So I believe the next picture shows Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston is probably the best known, certainly the best known of the early women black authors. She wrote a book in the 1920s called Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is a popular book to read both in African American studies and in women's studies. And Zora Neale Hurston was a woman who grew up in Florida. She was actually born in Florida on January 7th, and they think in 1901. She was born and raised in an all-black community, a small one, but all black people. And it was not until she actually started to go to school at about age 9 or 10 that she discovered that African Americans were looked upon as second-class citizens, and even little ones, even little girls like her, were discriminated against because of their color and their race. So, like I say, she became an author in the 1920s. She was involved with the Harlem Renaissance, as it's called, where there were a number of black authors and intellectuals. William Du Bois was active in those days. He was by then a pretty elderly gentleman, although he didn't pass away until age 100 in the 1960s. But Zora Neale Hurston was famous black author. Unfortunately, in her old age, she became quite poor. Of course, she'd been born poor, but she had done pretty well as an author in the 20s and 30s. But she finally became so poverty-stricken that she became a maid again in order to support herself and keep food on her table and so forth. And they say that she was buried in an unmarked grave, which is too bad a thing to say about a famous woman who was an outstanding author of her day, Zora Neale Hurston. Let's see who the next people we have are. The next woman on our list should be also someone with a January birthday. And that's Jackie Mitchell. Jackie Mitchell. Okay. Now, what's her claim to fame? Bet most of you have never heard of her. I'm not sure. I knew that there was such a person, but I didn't remember her name. But you notice that Jackie Mitchell is wearing a baseball outfit. And in 1931, she became the first woman to play professional baseball. Apparently, she was a really outstanding left-handed pitcher, and she was hired by the Chattanooga Lookouts in the Southern Association of Baseball in 1931, and she continued to work as a professional baseball player until 1936 or thereabouts. And so we should remember Jackie Mitchell for being the pioneer woman in professional baseball. And of course, that was before there were any women's league baseball. It's said that on her first day, they must have been playing the New York Yankees, because on the first day that she pitched, on April 2nd, 1931, she struck out Babe Ruth. And she not only struck out Babe Ruth, guess he couldn't get the best of her left-handed pitches there, but she also struck out Lou Gehrig. Now, there are the two most famous baseball players of the early 20th century. So Jackie Mitchell was someone we should definitely remember. Our next picture shows Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir is one of our French women. She's someone that I can recall hearing about in the 1940s and 50s, a French woman and a famous author. She wrote a book called The Second Sex. I must say that our lady who who wrote up the women in Remember the Ladies felt that her book was a little bit of a hard read, sort of going in different directions and not being perhaps as readily likable. I don't know. I do remember reading parts of A Second Sex and not having that particular reaction myself, but anyway, Simone de Beauvoir was someone who was famous not only in France, of course, and in Europe, but as an author in the late 40s and 50s. Worldwide, Simone de Beauvoir. And she was born in Paris in 1908. She said sometimes women are called the sex, by men, mostly, you know. The sex do this, the sex do that. I don't think that modern day men use that phrase much, but they were using that phrase back in the 40s to refer to the second sex, okay? The other sex, the non-male sex, the female sex. And that's why I think that she chose that title for her best-known book, but she wrote other books as well, Simone de Beauvoir. And she was also well known for being the companion of Jean-Paul Sartre, who was even more famous, and he was a philosopher, well-known philosopher of the 1940s and 50s. She was his lifelong companion. They never actually married, I guess, but they were very close companions, obviously. I think they also had their own separate apartments and so on. But they were frequently seen together in public, Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, famous French people, the two of them. Our next woman is Coco Chanel. Coco Chanel. Let's see if we've got a picture of her. Maybe we don't have a picture of her. I guess we didn't get one of her. She's another one of those French women. And she was a very well-known couturier, a person who made beautiful gowns and helped set fashion trends and so forth. Once again, a person from the 1940s, and actually earlier. She had sort of two big parts of her couturier life and line. One in the 20s and 30s. It was as early as 1922, she put out perfumes. In fact, the most famous of all perfumes is called Chanel, Chanel No. 5. Now, apparently that's not because she did 4 other kinds of perfume first, although she might have, but they claim in this book that she liked the number 5, and so she just called it Chanel 5, whatever it was in terms of her actual making of perfumes. But it is a beautiful, beautiful fragrance. And I do have a bottle of, not perfume itself, but of, the next step down. Nowadays, a lot of women don't wear that much cologne. But when I was a younger woman, cologne was quite popular. I think that finally there were so many people who objected to the fact that there were some people who were actually allergic to cologne, whether it was Chanel No. 5 or something else. Evening in Paris, I remember, was a very favorite perfume and cologne when I was young. And I once had a bottle of Evening in Paris cologne. But I guess I didn't get away from Nevada with that, but I still have my Chanel No. 5, which I hardly ever wear simply because nowadays people are afraid that if you wear cologne, you'll be running up against someone who is allergic to cologne and making it hard for them, which is too bad. Anyway, Coco Chanel was, like I say, obviously quite a well-to-do businesswoman because of having these, not only the beautiful dresses and so on that she styled, but also perfume. And so her birthday was in this is a death date. It says she died at 87 in Paris in 1971. So she was someone who was still around in my day. But we do have a picture, I think, next of Alice Paul. Here's a youthful picture of Alice Paul. She was one of the most outstanding feminists of the 20th century. She founded the Women's Party before the passage, actually, of the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote. She was she was an American, but she had spent time in England, and she had worked in England for women's suffrage before the First World War. And when she got back to the United States, she continued her work for women's suffrage here, because, as you know, women did not get the vote in the United States until 1920. So Alice Paul actually was better known in the 20s, after the passage of suffrage for women, the vote for women. She was known as the author of the Equal Rights Amendment. And in 1923, she first began promoting and urging the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment for women. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it, 20 plus words. That was the Equal Rights Amendment, which Alice Paul promoted. She was glad to see it passed finally by the U.S. legislature, by Congress, in 1973. Finally, the Equal Rights Amendment was sent to the states. But alas, all of a sudden, oh dear, equal rights for women. This is not right. I mean, what are husbands going to do? Can't they rule the roost anymore? There were various people who opposed Equal Rights Amendment, and Ohio was among the last states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, but we were only, I think, 33 or possibly 34, and you have to have 37 to ratify an amendment that has been passed by Congress and sent to the states. At least 37 states have to ratify it for it to become part of the American Constitution. We ratified in 1974, but it never made it. It never made it to 37. Illinois was one of the holdout states. That was the home of Phyllis Schlafly, and I've talked on this program, of course, about Mrs. Schlafly and her opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. And she was an Illinois citizen. She was one of the ones who was most prominent in keeping the Equal Rights Amendment from passing in Illinois, which was one of a number of northern and western states. Unfortunately, my state of Nevada being one of the others that refused to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And most of the others, though, were actually southern states. Many of them did not ratify. So on July 1st, 1982, was the first day after the expiration of the Equal Rights Amendment, because it was given a time for passage. Now, not all proposed amendments to the U.S. Constitution are given time for passage. As a matter of fact, I'm sorry, I can't tell you what it dealt with specifically, but there was one that was passed in the about 1800, but never finally ratified. A number of states had ratified it, but then it sort of fell by the wayside. I don't know, maybe it wasn't that important. Anyway, it was one that didn't have any time limit, and fairly recently it was passed, I guess just because someone decided, hey, what's going on here? Here's this proposed amendment's been around for, almost 200 years now, and why don't we pass it? So they did. A couple more states passed it, and that was it. But the Equal Rights Amendment definitely had a time limit on it, and so its time expired in 1982. Alas. But Alice Paul was around for quite a long time. She was born in 1885, and like I say, she lived in England before she came back to the U.S., and she finally passed away just about 40 years ago, in 1977. Alice Paul finally passed away. But I think there's still a Women's Party. Certainly the house that she lived in, which became the headquarters of the Women's Party, is now a place on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., very close to the Capitol building, where there is a women's center. And that's fairly new that this women's center has been set up as sort of the National Women's Center, the former home of Alice Paul on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Well, let's see who our next person is. After Anais Nin, and let's see. Well, I've got Janis Joplin here. Can we see Janis Joplin? Ah, there she is. This is a young woman who died far too soon. In fact, she died of a drug overdose while she was still in her 20s, in her late 20s. But Janis Joplin was a very well-known singer, sort of a rock and roll type singer, back in the late 70s. She actually died, she was born on the 19th of January, but she died in 1970 of a drug overdose. She was quite a popular singer in her day, though, and so we remember Janis Joplin and the fact that her birthday was the 19th of January. Now, I've got another woman here that I want to talk about that we don't have a picture of. She was born rather earlier than that. She was born on the 17th, let's see. Yeah, the 17th of January. Actually, there are two birth dates on the 17th of January. Very different women. One was, the earlier one was a woman called Lola Montez. Now, that certainly sounds like a Spanish-type name, right? And she was a well-known dancer in the 19th century. They have a picture of her teetering in this book. They have a picture of her teetering on her, well, she doesn't look like she's teetering, but she must be because she's dancing with one leg outstretched, her left leg outstretched, and she's on point with the right leg. Lola Montez was actually an English woman. She was born to English parents, but she took the name Lola Montez as a stage name, you might say, and she was certainly popular for doing dancing that was considered exotically Spanish in that day. Actually, she was since she died in 1861 on the 17th of January. Yeah, that was her death date. She was world famous dancer in the 19th century, and no one ever called her by her English name, I guess. She was known as Lola Montez right to the very end. She had quite an exotic life, being at one point the mistress of the Austrian emperor. Yeah, the emperor of Austria in the 19th century had Lola Montez as his mistress for some time. And so she was well known for her dancing and for her association with the Emperor of Austria, Ludwig I, who was also King of Bavaria. Well, maybe he wasn't the Austrian emperor. Maybe he was only the King of Bavaria. That sort of puts her back a little bit. Bavaria, of course, is a state in southern Germany. It's not in Austria itself. But in the 19th century and until the end of the First World War, Austria-Hungary was a very large Central European country, which included not only Austria and Hungary, but also Yugoslavia, and parts of Poland. The Austrian emperor of the time, back in about 1790, cooperated with the Russian Tsar and the Berlin emperor to carve up Poland. They've carved up Poland in 1792 between them. So Austria-Hungary was quite a big part of Central Europe until the First World War, when it was broken up into those constituent parts. Poland was reestablished as a nation. The parts that had been grabbed by Germany, Russia, and Austria were all taken back and made into Poland again. And that was something that was one of the outcomes of the First World War. probably one of the better outcomes, who knows. But Austria, Hungary became independent countries. Yugoslavia became independent. You know, the First World War was caused by the assassination of the heir to the Austrian Empire ship in Belgrade. It was in Sarajevo. Sarajevo is in Bosnia, but the Bosnia is part of Yugoslavia. Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, were all part of what today we call Yugoslavia. And the First World War started when the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo in June of 1914. That was the thing that touched off the First World War. And of course, it wouldn't have happened except for the fact that there were a lot of diplomatic treaties, so that finally the English got involved after there was an attack in Poland in 1914. But it had already started basically because the Austrians and the Russians were at odds. Together they were at odds against the people like the Germans who had supported the assassination. Well, wars and rumors of wars are very important and unfortunately a very big part of history. A lot of people just think it's just a series of wars, one war after another. But World War I was certainly one of the worst ones, and it definitely involved the Austrians. Well, now let's see, where are we here? We've talked about Janis Joplin. We had a picture of her. And I was going to tell you about the other person associated with January 17th, besides Lola Montez. And that was Catherine Booth. Catherine Booth was an English woman, and she and her husband were the founders of the Salvation Army. You know, we mostly see the Salvation Army, which is a religious denomination. We especially see them at Christmas time with their kettles and bells to gather money for people, especially at Christmas time, which is a time when want is want of, as in, you know, wanting food, wanting heat, and so on. In winter is particularly sad. And the Salvation Army is a religious denomination which specializes in taking care of people who are hungry, or people who are poor, and so on. Catherine Booth then was born in England in 1829, and then the Salvation Army was formed later in the 19th century by Catherine Booth and her husband. He was a sidewalk speaker. I guess they had kettles and bells in those days even too. But he used to talk at Hyde Park Corner in London about the problems of the poor and so forth. And on one occasion, his wife wanted to speak herself. And that was the first time she had spoken. But she made such a wonderful speech that after that she was featured with him, her husband as well, in speaking to people about the problems of the poor and the needs of society to do better for its hungry and poor members. Catherine Booth of January 17th. Well, here's another woman for the 18th. I didn't try to find her name, which is almost unpronounceable by me. It's Grizodubova, Valentina Grizodubova. And she was a famous Soviet aviatrix, whatever. You know, one of these women, among the first women to take long-distance flights. And in 1938, it says that she and two other women broke the women's world long-distance flying record. And although they had to have a crash landing eventually in a swamp, I guess, they still made history for their long-distance flight from Moscow to the Far East. It says they had flown 4,000 miles, nearly all of it in one direction, i.e., namely east from Moscow to, well, probably they landed, I think they wound up in Australia, so they must have landed eventually, perhaps in New Guinea, who knows. But she was born on the 18th of January in 1910, and her father was in the aviation business. He must have been one of the pioneers because, after all, as we know, it was 1903 when the Wright brothers did the first successful lengthy flights here in the United States. So her being born in 1910 and her father being in the aviation business already, she was raised to be in that business herself. Well, we talked about Janis Joplin. And now here's another important birthday, which actually just occurred. Birth anniversary just occurred. How many of you are watching the series on Victoria, Queen of England? This is quite a popular series being shown, I believe, on PBS. And anyway, I've been glued to the TVS, to the TV, watching that series for a couple of weeks now. I think maybe they've shown the last one, or they're going to be showing the last one soon. Or maybe it's that they've just started a new one and PBS is promoting something else which doesn't come on Sunday night. Anyway, Victoria is on Sunday night, and it's been really fascinating. It began with her becoming Queen of England, which she did in 1837, and she was only, at the time, she was only 18 years old. I think it was 37, might have been 39. No, it must have been 37 because Victoria Woodhull, a famous American feminist, was named, I think, sort of in honor of the Queen, even though she was an American born here in Ohio. She was born in 1838, so it must have been 1837 when Victoria came to the throne. Now, they point out what we're seeing is the young Victoria. Hey, pretty, etc., but very dedicated to her job of being queen. And, of course, she was the longest living Queen of England until last year, when Queen Elizabeth II bypassed her in terms of years in office. But Victoria was queen from 1837 till her death, which was in 1901. So that was over 60 years. And she gave her name to an age, they point out here. You know, most of the people, until they started showing this brand new TV series showing a young Victoria and a young Prince Albert, her husband, and so on, most people considered her, you know, they remembered the pictures of her as quite an old lady, very short, very stout, and very moralistic. And it's quite a difference to see. I think the moralism was didn't change any, probably, but it's quite interesting to see her as a beautiful young woman coping with problems that the English were having in 1837, 1840, etc., on the TV currently. So Victoria of England was born. No, she died. She died at age 81 on the Isle of Wight in 1901, it says. So we can't claim that as a birth date. I have to be very careful here because most of the entries are of births, but there are a few which are death dates, and this is one of them, Victoria of England, dying on the January 22nd, 1901. The next day, the 23rd, which is just yesterday, and as we pointed out, the anniversary of Roe versus Wade, the 23rd of January was the birth date of Anne Whitney. Now, she's not someone that I had ever heard of particularly. She died in 1915, but she was a famous sculptor in the 19th century. If she died at 93, she must have been born like in the 1830s. And she made statues of quite a few famous people eventually. It mentions that she had a lot of friends who were well-known 19th century activists, like Frances Willard, who was a women's rights person, Harriet Beecher Stowe, published Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Martineau, who was an English woman who came to the United States, and when she returned to England, she wrote a book called Society in America. Harriet Martineau is considered one of the founders of sociology. She took a huge trip around what was the United States in the 1830s. She went to Pioneer, Michigan, and Kentucky and Tennessee. But these were all people who knew Anne Whitney, the sculptor. And she was a feminist, an abolitionist, it says, too. She had a school in Massachusetts, and she wrote poetry, but in 1855, she began to make busts in marble and was quite well known in the 19th century as a sculptor. Well, let's see who else we have. Well, I should mention Edith Wharton, born, there we go. She was born Edith Jones in New York City in 1862. Wharton was her married name. She was, she's still read as a woman novelist. It says that she wrote 20 novels, which were popular, and supported herself actually with her writing in her lifetime, which was kind of a hard thing to do back in the old days. And that's one of our people. Next, we see Virginia Woolf, who was born in 1882. There's Virginia Woolf, probably the best-known woman author in England of the 20th century. She wrote, especially in the 1920s and 30s, a wonderful author. If you haven't seen her, read her works, you really ought to do it. And she also wrote an essay called A Room of One's Own, and how important it was for women to have a place where they could be quiet and concentrate, especially if they were writers like she was, an author. She was a woman who wrote wonderful things in addition to the essay, Room of One's Own. But she was plagued during her lifetime by mental illness, and she finally committed suicide in 1941. She'd had a number of different sessions of mental illness, and she felt that she was going down again. Says she put rocks in her pocket and walked into the River Ouse in England. That was in 1941. Well, I guess that's most of the people we have a picture of. Maybe we have a picture of Germaine Greer. If we do, we probably ought to see her. There's Germaine Greer, saucy feminist. And it says Germaine Greer down in the small, that even men like. And here, there she is on the cover of Time. And next we have Tallulah Bankhead, who was an actress especially. She was an actress. Her father was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, U.S. House of Representatives, but she was a well-known actress in the 1930s and 40s, and I remember seeing her in Lifeboat, which was a Hitchcock film, probably her best-known role. Well, we've run through our time, and my watch is showing that it's time to say that this is Lois Whaley, feminist, and this is my show, Women Today and Yesterday.